In the summer of 1995, the Prime Minister, John Major, decided that he'd had enough and put himself up for re-election.
What was intolerable was to go on with the party forming a circle and opening fire.
In short, it is time to put up or shut up.
The party had gone beyond hope and was not capable of having its divisions healed.
Now, John Major claims he was always a reluctant Prime Minister.
I never had a game plan. I was not sitting there thirsting to become Prime Minister.
I think he was a very, very strong man, tough as old boots. The strength of character is, I think, more remarkable given how easily hurt he can be and how socially vulnerable he is.
The woman he replaced, Margaret Thatcher, became his severest critic.
In retrospect, I suppose I can now say, I think her behaviour was intolerable.
Time and again, his leadership was questioned.
John Major was one of the nicest people ever to walk the hallowed halls of Westminster, and just the wrong person ever to be Prime Minister.
What happened behind the scenes can now be told. The struggle for power, the conflicts with colleagues, and the personal frustration and sense of failure which made John Major want to quit.
There were moments when one got very depressed. I certainly did. I was persuaded to stay, but I shall probably wonder to the end of my days whether that was the right decision.
Where you see the house ahead, with the two white arches, immediately opposite there, that is where we lived.
Shortly before the 1992 general election, John Major returned to his roots in Brixton to make an election broadcast.
It's still there. It's still there. It's hardly changed.
Our communications people had this brilliant idea that we should allow John to talk about his past, that we would be able to demonstrate how genuinely humble his upbringings were and how he'd triumphed over this social adversity. And there was then an attempt to sort of kit him out in Austin Reed's best, which threw him a bit. Don't think he'd ever had an Austin Reed label before. And then he was marched down to Brixton to do it and threw up. I mean, he hated it. He hated every minute of it.
John Major's reluctance to take part in the broadcast stemmed from a deep sensitivity about his past. He never wanted to make political capital out of his difficult boyhood in South London in the 1950s and his colourful parents. It was the start of a painful, even obsessive relationship with the press.
Some people would sneer in a patronising fashion at the fact that my father made garden ornaments for a living at one stage, or that he'd spent some time in the circus, or that he'd been a music hall artist. I must say that patronising sneering at two people who I knew were better than those who were sneering at them did strike home, and I freely confess it hurt. It gave me a contempt for the sneerers. I've no embarrassment about my parents.
This is Cold Harbour Lane, all these old houses with the basements down there. And the Enterprise...
The Prime Minister may have been so sensitive because there were many secrets in his family.
And that's the house we lived in for...
He was then only dimly aware that his father had many affairs and an extended family. In 1955, the near collapse of his business had forced the Majors to move to cheap lodgings in Cold Harbour Lane.
Our landlord at Brixton was not some casual landlord that my parents had found, finding somewhere for us to live. It was, in fact, my half-brother, who had been born just at the turn of the century. And then, perhaps even more surprisingly, I discovered that I had a half-sister who was still alive, who had been born in the 1920s. And I think it imbued in me a sense of tolerance for people who made mistakes that I learned directly from my own experience. You can make mistakes and do something extremely foolish, perhaps almost unforgivable, and still not be a bad person who should be dismissed. You're just human, and you've just made mistakes.
The landlord in Brixton was John Major's half-brother. He had a son, Tom, who became the constant companion and playmate of the young John Major.
He was special. He was full of energy. He was physically robust. He was bright. And I think what really distinguished him is that he was the only child I knew who could talk back to adults and get away with it.
It may have been this cheekiness which led to the young boy's precocious interest in politics.
I don't recall other kids of 12 years old sitting on the curb outside the candy store talking about politics, but that was the thing we did, and we were in short pants at the time. Whenever there was an election campaign, we discussed the candidates and the issues to the extent that we knew them.
John Major went to Rutlish, a grammar school which sought to emulate the public school system. To his great distress, his family insisted he register as John Major Ball. Major was his father's stage name, and Ball his father's original surname. Perhaps for this reason, or because of the family's descent into poverty, his progress at Rutlish was dismal. He left with only 3 O-levels, a fact he kept secret for many years.
My parents always hoped and expected a great deal of me. And when they were alive, I didn't deliver any of that. For a range of circumstances, I never settled down at the school. I didn't like the school. I didn't work at the school. I wasn't particularly a troublemaker, but I was pretty alienated from the system there. And I left school with a miserable academic record that must, given their expectations, have been quite heartbreaking for them. And through sheer idleness and disinterest and a determination almost not to conform at school, I let them down. And when I went home with those dreadful examination failures, when they knew I should have passed and I knew I should have passed, even then there was no reproach. You could see the hurt at the failure, but there was no reproach. And I realized then that I just had to do it better in future.
The combination of an unconventional family, an elderly and infirm father, and above all his own lack of formal education, left an indelible mark on John Major, and would be the spur which drove him from Cold Harbour Lane to Downing Street.
Someone who is, by birth and upbringing, an outsider, who, so to speak, peers through the fence at the children playing on the other side, feels at the same time rather excluded, and also at the same time perhaps a burning ambition to show them what he can do, to be respected by them.
And I think as it transpired, it was only this vision he had of getting involved in politics which somehow lifted him out of the mire at that time.
As a young man, John Major's passionate desire for self-advancement found a home in the Young Conservatives. It was then that he became a soapbox orator outside Party HQ in Brixton. For 6 years, he had a relationship with Jean Kierans, a divorced woman 13 years his senior. She helped him grow in confidence and maturity. John Major was elected a Lambeth councillor in 1968 and made chair of the housing department 2 years later. He was always on the moderate wing of the party. He married Norma Johnson, a teacher, in 1970, and with her help began the search for a constituency. At the age of 35, John Major was elected MP for the safe Conservative seat of Huntingdonshire in 1979.
I never accepted, even from my earliest age, that because I didn't come from a conventional background, I couldn't be a Conservative. Or because I didn't come from a conventional background and go to university, I couldn't get into the House of Commons. That seemed to me to be an absurdity. If the Commons was what it was originally intended to be, the Commons, then it had to be a proper balance from right across the country. And I always felt that politics was like bicycling. If you got on your bike and you kept on going, then one day, with a reasonable measure of luck, good fortune, and hard work, you would get where you wished to be.
John Major, powered by this burning ambition, now embarked on one of the most rapid rises in the history of the Conservative Party. In 1983, he became a government whip and began to be noticed. Few MPs worked so hard at cultivating friends and contacts at every level of the party.
He had a drive and a commitment and an energy which put him, as far as my own contemporaries were concerned, in a completely different league to the rest of us.
I think we can now say we are there. Cheers. Cheers.
John Major's advance was always helped by his relaxed charm, which made people from all backgrounds feel at ease in his company, especially women.
You felt that it was a genuine and sincere charm. He had, right from the beginning, that talent of making you feel, when you talked to him, that you were the only person that mattered. But I think it was true. I think he was able to absorb from people whatever he needed from them, and to give them his undivided attention.
Mrs. Thatcher, the Prime Minister, quickly came to appreciate his charming manner and approved of his diligence. Colleagues on the fringes looked on with wry amusement.
Margaret Thatcher was besotted with John Major. He was her darling, her, if she had such a thing, her toy boy. She doted on him. She promoted him very rapidly, if you look at his political career. He obviously charmed her.
In 1987, Mrs. Thatcher made him Chief Secretary to the Treasury, working for Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor. It was John Major's first cabinet job and brought him into regular contact with the Prime Minister.
He understood his brief when he went to see her. She couldn't catch him out on the details of it. And she liked all that. And of course, John has an ability through innate courtesy to appear to agree with whoever he's talking to.
And that way we may get the swiftest outcome. That seems to be very agreeable.
It's a very irritating thing when you find that he's agreed with somebody else of opposite opinions as well.
I'm sure that John Major didn't consciously deceive Mrs. Thatcher. But of course, all of us around Mrs. Thatcher knew what she liked and what she wanted, and it was very easy to echo, to some extent, echo her own thoughts, anticipate her views. You could ingratiate yourself in that way at no very great cost.
John Major was a man few in the world of politics knew really well. Although he spent time cultivating his contacts, he was always happiest at home with his books or watching cricket. He rarely discussed political ideas with Mrs. Thatcher. Indeed, she pushed him up the ladder of government so fast that she never had time to find out whether he was one of us or not.
He was moderate, one-nation conservative, had a strong social conscience, he had an understanding of social policy and the public services, which he combined with being a straightforward Tory who believed in market economics and the things we were doing. If Margaret thought he was what nowadays gets called a Thatcherite, she had misunderstood him.
John Major spent 2 years at the Treasury as Chief Secretary, the most junior position in the Cabinet. Then, in July 1989, Mrs. Thatcher summoned him to Downing Street. She had some astonishing news.
She sat there with a bloom on her cheeks. When she had a bloom on her cheeks and was looking particularly happy, then she usually had something rather grand to bestow. And the Prime Minister said to me, hold on to your seatbelt. You're the centrepiece of the reshuffle, and I would like you to be Foreign Secretary. And my heart sank.
Good morning. Good morning. What would you like me to do? Just stand down for a moment.
Despite his ambition, John Major was clearly daunted. He knew nothing of foreign affairs, and at 46 was relatively young for the job. To go from being the most junior member of Cabinet to Foreign Secretary was an astonishing advance. and a clear signal that Mrs. Thatcher regarded him as a potential successor.
How do you feel about being the youngest Foreign Secretary since Dr. David Owen 12 years ago?
Well, I'm not sure I myself would care to put it quite that way, but I'm very pleased to be Foreign Secretary.
Oh, I think he was shattered. I think he was taken aback. I think he was knocked out, as they say. I remember him coming out of the study and thinking I had a sense of humour. I asked him what the capital of Ecuador was, and he couldn't answer, nor could I don't think. I took him off into a room close to the Prime Minister's study, and frankly he sat down in a chair for a few minutes to recover and collect himself.
Suddenly he was overwhelmed with the world, with a whole series of problems in different countries, different continents, which were new to him, except in the most elementary way. He was dismayed by the number and the complexity of the things that came at him out of his Foreign Office boxes.
John Major never had time to shine as Foreign Secretary. Mrs. Thatcher's powerful position on the world stage meant that she tended to eclipse him at meetings with world leaders. But his discomfort as Foreign Secretary did not last long. Margaret Thatcher's relations with her once revered Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, had broken down, and in October 1989, Lawson declared he could not go on and resigned. Once again, John Major was summoned to her presence.
Could it be a rocky week, Chancellor?
She may have the reputation of being the Iron Lady in the public eye, but she's very human as well. And I think apart from the politics of it, she was hurt. And it seemed to me that she was fairly close to tears, and I just put my hand out and put my hand over her hand for a moment or two while we talked about what might happen.
The Prime Minister appointed John Major Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had been Foreign Secretary for only 94 days. Once more he was in his element. At the Treasury he loved. If Mrs. Thatcher was unaware of the political beliefs of her protégé, it was partly because she had never given him breathing space to develop them.
I was moving through government faster than a counter goes around the monopoly board. So there wasn't a great deal of time to step back and make philosophic speeches. I was too busy dealing with the practicalities of the day. I wasn't hiding my views. Those people who knew me knew my views very well.
Now, as Chancellor, he had the opportunity to make those views plain to the world. To Mrs. Thatcher's horror, John Major insisted on Britain joining Europe's exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, in order to fight inflation.
Sometime later, Lady Thatcher wrote that I was drifting intellectually with the tide, the pro-European tide. Well, if that was her view, she certainly didn't say so at the time. She certainly didn't say so to me, and she certainly did not advance that as an argument for changing the policy that I was advocating.
John Major did show a certain amount of steel because she couldn't lose two chancellors. And if the new chancellor came along and argued that we should be joining the ERM, Margaret didn't really have an alternative. Even Margaret Thatcher at that stage could not simply slung out another Chancellor of the Exchequer and try to find one that agreed with her. And into the ERM we went.
Just as Mrs. Thatcher was declining, John Major was in the ascendant. By taking Britain into the ERM, he confirmed his power over the now vulnerable Prime Minister and placed himself in pole position in the race to succeed her, whether he wished it or not.
I never had a game plan about what the next job would be and whether I would become Prime Minister. Lots of people have subsequently suggested that I did, but I didn't. I operated largely by what I think was the Ian MacLeod maxim. If the ball comes in your direction, grab it. And in politics, the ball often came in my direction, and I did grab it.
Is this for next Friday?
No, this is.
Okay.
I had observed him when he was Chancellor and I was Chief Secretary, and one of the things I noticed was that John spent an amazing amount of time, a truly astonishing amount of time, speaking in MPs' constituencies, to their associations, their businessmen's clubs, and he was remarkably assiduous.
I did one for
There is no doubt in my mind that he was thinking about becoming Prime Minister and had been thinking for quite some time.
Right.
In public, John Major was as loyal as ever to the woman who had advanced him so far and so fast. But privately, he was beginning to have doubts about her continuing ability to lead the party.
It seemed to me that Margaret was no longer examining the facts before reaching the decision. She was operating on gut instinct, and from time to time one saw ideas put forward, perhaps sometimes tossed forward quite loosely, that just ran into the slammed door of a closed mind.
In the spring of 1990, riots had broken out in central London over the poll tax, a policy very close to Mrs. Thatcher's heart. She clung doggedly to it despite massive opposition, not only in the streets, but also in Parliament and Cabinet. After more than a decade in power, many felt the unrest was the surest sign that she had lost her grip.
No! No! No!
And her attitude to Europe caused confusion at summits and reinforced many of her colleagues' concerns about her leadership.
The problem was mainly that Margaret was suddenly becoming more anti-European than she'd been before. She was always instinctively not very pro-European, but she was going quite vehemently anti. And I think, frankly, in the last year or two, Margaret was beginning to get more individual and pursuing her own moods and whims in the government, and was perhaps slightly losing touch.
Good morning. On the 14th of November, Mrs. Thatcher's sworn enemy, Michael Heseltine, announced that he was challenging the Prime Minister for the leadership of the Conservative Party. His decision was triggered by the resignation of Sir Geoffrey Howe. Heseltine had stormed out of the Cabinet nearly 5 years before. John Major, Chancellor of the Exchequer, was the insider's favourite for the top job should she fall. But he was giving nothing away.
The Prime Minister has been nominated by the Foreign Secretary, seconded by me. We expect her to win. We hope she will win. We hope she will remain leader of the Conservative Party.
Are you confident?
I hope and expect and am confident that that will be the case. It's certainly the best outcome.
What happens if she doesn't win on the first ballot, Mr. Major?
She will. Mrs. Thatcher, could I ask?
Mrs. Thatcher was in Paris when the result of the first ballot came through. She was badly wounded.
I'm very pleased that I got more than half the parliamentary party and disappointed that it's not quite enough to win on the first ballot. So I confirm it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot.
The next day she returned to London, apparently determined to continue.
I fight to win.
That afternoon, Mrs. Thatcher telephoned John Major. He was at home after an operation on his teeth.
The first thing she said in a rather breathy way straight away was, "I want you to second my nomination." And she wrote later that there was a palpable pause. And there was. There was a palpable pause. I did pause. And it wasn't because I was disinclined to support her. I was always prepared to support her and second her nomination. It was because that approach, after a bad first-round ballot defeat, was exactly what had caused her so much difficulty in the party. This peremptory assumption. It was just, "I would like you to second my nomination." And it seemed to me that that was exactly the mistake of man management. And that was the reason for the pause.
John Major, closeted at home in Huntingdon, was recovering from his wisdom tooth operation. His lack of enthusiasm might have had another motive. Away from the fevered atmosphere of Westminster, he was aware that the crown was about to pass from Mrs. Thatcher. It could well pass to him. By keeping his head down at home, he did very little to help the beleaguered Prime Minister, but escaped charges of disloyalty. He sent out a handwritten note to reporters, saying only that he anticipated seconding her in the next ballot.
It was poor repayment for what she had done for him. John Major certainly owed everything to Margaret Thatcher, but of course gratitude is a rare commodity in politics, and it shouldn't be expected too much.
I was not an eager entrant into the fray, and I would have preferred to have stayed a good deal longer at the job that I'd always wished to have, that of Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was not a terribly convenient time for me to move on to be Prime Minister. You can't turn it down if it happens, but it was not a terribly convenient time. I was not sitting there thirsting to become Prime Minister.
When I discussed with him tentatively the idea of standing or being leader, he would say, well, I'm not sure that I'm ready for it. He did say that. And he did also say, I'm not sure that I want it. But I think he did want to be Prime Minister. Of course, people can have two thoughts in their minds at one time.
It was left to John Major's colleagues to deal the fatal blow to the Prime Minister and remove her from office. On the evening of the 21st of November, they went one by one to Westminster and told Margaret Thatcher that with so little support in the first ballot, she was finished and had to go. The following day, she confirmed her resignation to Cabinet. The news was announced to an astonished world.
It looked as though Heseltine might inherit. That would have been dreadful. Apart from anything else, any difficulties which the party has had since would have been as nothing had the man that pulled her down succeeded her. And so there was a look around everywhere, well, who else could succeed her? And the field was not terribly good. Acorns seldom grow under the great oak.
John Major was the obvious candidate. On the day Mrs. Thatcher resigned, he returned from Huntingdon to confirm he was standing, with her blessing.
I believe I would like the opportunity of trying to unite the party. A lot of colleagues have suggested to me that I may be able to do so.
The battle to replace Margaret Thatcher began.
So nice to see you again so speedily.
The Major campaign team was led by Norman Lamont, with William Hague in attendance. Norman Lamont then shared Mrs. Thatcher's view that he was sound on the most important issue.
One of the main reasons that I supported John Major enthusiastically was that I felt he was much more cautious about Europe than Michael Heseltine or Douglas Hurd. And that was why I and many other people backed him.
Two others were standing, Michael Heseltine and Douglas Hurd. Michael Heseltine may have been the most charismatic of the three candidates, but for most Conservative MPs, his role as the assassin of Margaret Thatcher put him beyond the pale.
They'll all speak for themselves, and I've made it quite clear that I'm the Truman of this campaign, the David fighting off the backbenchers, the little guy, but the little guy who's going to win.
Quite a big little guy.
The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd had the backing of many party grandees, but was considered by colleagues to be too old-fashioned and stuffy. His efforts to play down his old Etonian background backfired disastrously. John Major seemed a much better bet to win the next general election.
Are you a fatalist, Mr. Major?
I'm an optimist.
At 47, he was the youngest contender. Despite the moderate tone of his campaign, Mrs. Thatcher remained right behind him.
She was assiduous. She threw herself into the campaign completely, putting great pressure on people. She thought that John Major was the nearest that there was available to someone who was going to continue her legacy. I think possibly also it may be a sort of therapy that, having not campaigned for herself, the thing to do in the aftermath of the terrible loss of office, which was like a bereavement to her, was to throw herself energetically into a campaign.
I was having lunch with some friends in the country and the telephone rang and it was Margaret Thatcher on the phone, and she was very brisk in her normal style. She just simply said, hello, Simon, he's pure gold. And I kind of startled at this, and I thought, you know, partly who and what. He's pure gold, pure gold.
But Mrs. Thatcher's interventions were not always welcome. During a farewell visit to Conservative Central Office, she said that whilst she might be leaving John Major at the controls, she would still be a very good back-seat driver.
I was very alarmed. I was very alarmed because I could see immediately that it was going to cause damage. If I agreed with her policies, I would be seen simply, as the Labour Party put it, as the son of Thatcher. Where I disagreed, it would be said that I was wrecking her legacy. And so I saw from the outset that that remark would cast a very long shadow indeed, and it did. It was the first part of the wedge that was to come between us.
The press was already on the case.
Are you Mrs. Thatcher's puppet?
With Margaret Thatcher's support, John Major's campaign to win the leadership of the Conservative Party and to become Prime Minister became unstoppable.
You could sense from the body language of the people in the tea room that something had changed. A week or so ago, I'd been the Chancellor of the Exchequer who would sit down and have a cup of tea and a bun with them in the tea room. But there was just this separate, rather slightly more tense atmosphere when I walked in, and it was compelling.
I'm very pleased with the way the campaign's going, thank you, but some way to go.
And it was then that I thought it was possible, perhaps even probable, that I might win.
The results of the secret ballot of Conservative MPs to elect the leader were announced in the evening on Tuesday the 27th of November 1990.
Michael Heseltine, 131. Douglas Hurd, 56. John Major, 185.
The election could have gone to another round, but Douglas Hurd and Michael Heseltine both conceded defeat immediately.
I congratulate John Major. I thank him and Douglas Hurd for an absolute...
John Major is the right leader for this task.
But he's a jolly good fellow.
After only 11 years in the House of Commons and just 3.5 years in Cabinet, John Major became leader of the Conservative Party.
I'm very pleased with the result. It was within 4 votes of our estimate. We're very pleased. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Thatcher, how did you vote?
At the same time, Mrs. Thatcher returned from the House of Commons, where she had voted for John Major, to join the celebrations in Downing Street.
We went upstairs to the main stateroom in number 11, where there were maybe 100 people, I suppose, gathered. And I saw one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. When John walked up the stairs and into the room, the entire room shifted from around Margaret to being around John. And it was as though one actually had seen the power shift from one person to another. And there really were only 2 or 3 people left talking to Margaret. It was an extraordinary sight.
Mrs. Thatcher was keen to join her successor in front of the cameras outside, but John Major was mindful of her recent comment that she would be a good backseat driver.
Margaret said very warmly, "Oh, but I'll come out with you." And of course that would have absolutely played upon that image. And it would have been a very bad start. I think it would have been bad for her, and it would certainly have been pretty bad for me. And so Norman Lamont, how he did it I don't know, but with great skill, disattached her. And I went out to see people on my own. Now in retrospect I rather regret that, because although it would have meant a little short-term criticism and a little short-term mockery from the Labour Party, I think it would have been more gracious to have gone out with someone who'd been Prime Minister for 11 years.
It is a very exciting thing to become leader of the Conservative Party, and particularly exciting, I think, to follow one of the most remarkable leaders that the Conservative Party has ever had.
Mrs. Thatcher was forced to watch events from an upstairs window. It was another rebuff, and added to the bitterness she and her friends felt after her enforced removal from office.
We're going to unite totally and absolutely, and we're going to win the next general election. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you all very much. My first task of
Oh, I think it was appallingly hurtful. It would have been one thing to have been voted out of office by the people. You can understand that. That's what happens in a democracy. But knifed in your back by your own MPs, lily-livered beggars that they were. You can imagine how that hurt.
The following morning, a tearful Mrs. Thatcher left number 10 for the last time.
Now it's time for a new chapter to open, and I wish John Major all the luck in the world. He'll be splendidly served, and he has the makings of a great Prime Minister, which I'm sure he'll be in very short time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
What she called treachery with a smile on its face, and others dubbed a daylight assassination, left its mark on the Conservative Party for many years to come, and would poison John Major's premiership.
I think it made it very difficult for him. A lot of the people who supported him and whose support he needed harboured a sense of guilt in some cases and resentment in others that Margaret Thatcher had been deposed in the very rough way that she was. And there was this background of Queen over the water, which she did nothing to discourage, and which certainly made his life difficult.
As Mrs. Thatcher was driven into the wilderness, the machinery of government went into action, with its routine yet ruthless efficiency. John Major left Buckingham Palace, where he was having an audience with the Queen, and returned to number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. On the way, he mused about his astonishing rise from a boyhood in Brixton to be leader of his country.
After I left the Queen, the car began to drive down the Mall. It's a very short journey from the Mall to number 10. It had occurred to me it was a very long journey from Cold Harbour Lane to number 10. And I decided to set out, before I went into number 10, precisely what it was I most passionately cared about. And I scribbled some notes on the back of an envelope. And that was the origin of the statement I then made.
In particular, I want to see us build a country that is at ease with itself, a country that is confident, and a country that is prepared and willing to make the changes necessary to provide a better quality of life for all our citizens.
What I had in mind was an end to the poll tax riots, an end to the bitterness and the hostility that we'd found on the doorstep, an end to the exclusion of many of the minority groups who felt they were outside the race to prosperity that we'd seen throughout so much of the 1980s. Those were the matters that were in my mind when I spoke outside Downing Street and when I turned to walk through that black door for the first time as Prime Minister.
John Major's words on the steps gave a signal that he would not slavishly follow the woman who had championed his rise and whom he now replaced. The change in outlook caused much difficulty in the years to come.
I think she thought that he would be a second-generation Thatcherite who would want to advance what she may have seen as the Thatcher Revolution rather further, whereas I think John Major came to office thinking that he should try and calm it all down. I think he wanted rather more consensus and rather less confrontation.
Oh yes, of course. Right.
John Major was a very different character from Mrs. Thatcher. He was far more sensitive to criticism, and given his extraordinary background, seemed more vulnerable, and, understandably perhaps, lacked her self-confidence.
He was a young man, younger than we'd had as Prime Minister for quite a time. He was a relatively inexperienced man. It was a big step. And I remember him coming in that first morning and saying rather disarmingly, I don't know if I can do this job. I wasn't really expecting it yet.
Without the long years of experience of Mrs. Thatcher, John Major was far more reliant on the advice and views of his colleagues in Cabinet. The change in leadership style was immediate.
Thus far it seems to go well. Are there any other further comments on community business?
It was much more what a cabinet government is supposed to be like. Much more rational, and it's how any sensible person would think you might conduct a cabinet. Of course, the problem was when people began to be disloyal later on, they were not very frightened of him.
John Major's informal, personal style and easy manner endeared the new Prime Minister to those who worked with him. He always disliked grandiose official functions and state banquets. It was a marked change from the pomp of Mrs. Thatcher's court.
At the beginning, he disappeared and gave the slip to his security guards to go up to Victoria Street to find himself a McDonald's. And he always had very simple tastes. Didn't like rich food, didn't like heavy cooking, and was much more likely just to have a takeaway or something simple up in the flat than to want to plough through 5 courses.
When he was at the Treasury, John Major was always happy to join staff in the canteen.
John preferred beer and well-done burgers to rocket salad with things that had been drizzled over or seared.
Very nice indeed.
I think that just says that he was very English in his tastes.
I've always had this idea that people want to elect an ordinary person to be Prime Minister, but once the person is Prime Minister, they want that person to be rather exceptional and not very ordinary. So, for instance, when John Major was going to Happy Eaters and so on, I just thought that was a wrong interpretation of how to do things. There are certain trappings that go with the office, and I wasn't very happy with that approach.
The immediate challenge for this untested new Prime Minister was to become a war leader. In August 1990, 4 months before John Major had become Premier, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces had invaded Kuwait. In response, thousands of British and American troops, together with air and naval forces, were sent to the Gulf. Just 1 week after taking office, John Major flew to a wintry Washington to meet President Bush for talks about the crisis at his Camp David retreat. At first, the Americans had been unnerved by the rapid removal of Mrs. Thatcher, but it soon became apparent that John Major's style was much more in tune with that of George Bush. Indeed, it seemed to be a relief for the president not to have to deal with Mrs. Thatcher.
The Prime Minister has been very fruitful, at least from the United States standpoint.
With John, I felt totally relaxed all the time, and we could make, say, jokes, and he was very easy for Barbara and me to be with, to be around, to have in our home. Not that Margaret was difficult, but it was just a different dimension there.
President Bush liked informality. He liked to relax up at Camp David with jeans and cowboy boots, feet on the table, beer can in hand. While Mrs. Thatcher was there in high heels, handbag and tweed suit. Of course, John Major fitted much more easily into George Bush's idea of a chap, somebody you could sit down with and be at ease with, somebody you could wander around wearing a pullover, have a walk with, have a chat with.
But there were deadly serious decisions to be made, including the date of the forthcoming Allied offensive to retake Kuwait.
The thing that impressed me is Major could well have said, look, I've just taken over. Let me call my defense minister. Let me call somebody else over there and get the cabinet together when I get back. I'm sure we'll be with you, but I'd feel more comfortable if I had my team on board. Nope. He said, absolutely, you can count on us 100%. Never flinched. We'd be side by side every inch of the way.
This conflict had the potential to unleash a range of horrors. The Prime Minister was in command of Britain's nuclear weapons and would have to be ready, if necessary, to use them against.
We were pretty confident that he had both chemical and biological weapons. It was the biggest fear that we had as we came up to the Gulf War. But he was given an unmistakable message that the response would be dramatic if he chose to use that sort of weapon in the conflict to come. He was told diplomatically precisely the scale of response there would be, but I don't wish to enlarge on that.
On the 7th of January 1991, John Major flew to the Gulf to see the situation at first hand. The conflict turned out to be John Major's honeymoon as Prime Minister. He was popular at home. On the diplomatic front, he impressed the Americans and Russians with his negotiating skill, and his personal style was well suited to his encounters with the desert rats.
Fine. Well, thank you very much indeed. I must say it's worse than the House of Commons, isn't it? Look at you.
Meeting the young combat troops was a moving experience for the Prime Minister, who realized that he would soon be sending them into war.
Thinking there and what we think is happening. If I could just say...
When I had met the servicemen, I had been very struck by how young they were. They were pretty much the same age as my son. My son was just a little bit younger. And when I thought of them and saw them, I often inadvertently transposed James's face on their bodies. I could see those young men as just a little older than my own son.
With that thought in mind, John Major made a prime ministerial broadcast to the nation on his return to Britain.
And our prayers are also for you, their families, who carry so much of the burden of Saddam's war. We are no less proud of you. Good night, and God bless.
When I saw that, I threw a fit. I dare say others did too. I thought it was not the sort of thing. I thought it was a bit naff, to be honest. But he was absolutely dead right. When he said it, it sounded right. It clearly went down well. It just shows how wrong advisors can get it.
Just before midnight, on Wednesday the 16th of January, Operation Desert Storm began. 5 weeks later, ground troops attacked Iraqi forces and recaptured Kuwait. On the 28th of February, President Bush announced a ceasefire, leaving Saddam Hussein in power in Iraq. Many predicted that he would fall from power within the year. In the months to come, Mrs. Thatcher would criticize John Major and George Bush for not ordering troops to press on to Baghdad.
The United Nations resolutions gave the Allies the authority to expel the Iraqis from Kuwait. It expressly did not give the Allies the authority to proceed into Iraq and to drag Saddam Hussein out by the heels. We would have broken the law, we would have broken up the coalition, we would perhaps never have been able to put such a coalition together again in the future. Add to that the fact that the generals said we should stop, that the soldiers were engaged on what people at the time were calling a turkey shoot. These were all points that the hindsight warriors, who tell us with the benefit of 50-50 vision much later that we should have done something different. It was very, very, very frustrating. But we had gone to war to maintain the rule of law, not to break the rule of law.
Early in March 1991, John Major returned to the Gulf to express his gratitude to British troops for their contribution.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. This will give me cabinet authority of a sort.
John Major's personal standing was never higher. An opinion poll showed that he was the most liked Prime Minister for 30 years. The war had given him a new confidence and authority. By contrast, Margaret Thatcher was finding it difficult to fill her days.
My grandson I took to Hamleys this morning. Nearly 2. And what did you buy? What did we buy? We bought a railway line.
You know, many people have said maybe Mrs. Thatcher should have been given a role after she left office. If something could be found for her, whether in Britain or internationally, she would have been less of a thorn in John Major's flesh. That's simply unrealistic. International jobs were out of the question. After all, Mrs. Thatcher had spent 12 years being rude to almost every international organisation you can think of, and therefore none of them are going to really give her priority in leading them.
At home, there was no political role for her, and the former Prime Minister was forced to spend her days like minor royalty, touring garden centres and visiting new displays at museums.
You would have had to have had a heart of stone not to have understood the frustration that she must have faced. I think I have always been an observer of people. I don't think you needed to be a very acute observer to realize that what had happened to her must have been immensely hurtful.
After he became Prime Minister, John Major never seemed at ease in her company.
The first time I ever saw them together in public was at a charity function, and they went outside and stood there in front of the assembled, you know what it's like, the huge array of flashing lights and television cameras, and of course there are always people shouting questions.
Is Mr. Major doing a good job as Prime Minister?
Yes. Excellent.
Any hard
Triple A.
And it suddenly burst with rain. And Margaret turned to John and said, "It didn't rain very much when I was Prime Minister." And of course she meant it light-heartedly and as a joke, but it was taken very badly, and you could see how deeply John felt about this, because he failed to laugh. He didn't think it was funny, he took it very personally. I think he felt emotionally uncomfortable when in her presence, at least that was my impression from that occasion.
In March 1991, John Major visited Bonn and set about rebuilding the relations with the rest of Europe that Mrs. Thatcher had so badly damaged. Like President Bush, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl found the new Prime Minister's emollient style a welcome change.
When I became Prime Minister, the relationship with our European partners was frankly rather poor. They took the view that the British stood apart, They shouted from the terraces, but they rarely engaged in the main game. And I thought the best way to proceed was to go into Europe and set out my concerns, my hopes, my aspirations, the things I would concede, the things I couldn't accept, in a speech actually inside Europe.
With the help of the pro-European Chris Patten, John Major wrote a speech that seemed calculated to offend Mrs. Thatcher and please the Europeans.
My aims for Britain in the community can be simply stated. I want us to be where we belong, at the very heart of Europe.
The battle lines were drawn up. On a visit to America, Margaret Thatcher made her concerns about Europe plain in a series of speeches.
She was totally opposed to the greater involvement in Europe, the greater move to federalism. And she'd stood out very strongly against that, the no, no, no at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. And she saw that being weakened. And that certainly intensified her disenchantment with John Major.
Margaret Thatcher established a foundation to ensure her legacy was preserved. She surrounded herself with loyal acolytes who shared her more outspoken views, especially on Europe.
Their concern was to boost her, to make her feel better, to encourage her in everything that she had done. And one of the ways they did it was by disparaging everybody else. And then, of course, they carried every whisper, every mention, every tiny bit of frustration she uttered in private out into public. And so it spread out into the public prints and began to spread into the Conservative Party as well.
In the summer of 1991, an article appeared in the Telegraph in which Margaret Thatcher was reported as being openly critical of John Major. She was alleged to have dismissed him as a grey man with no ideas.
Almost in terms of a Greek tragedy, we were forced apart by the activities of events and people who muttered and talked about what it was Margaret thought in private.
John Major's public image was of an easygoing man, but behind the scenes he could be temperamental. Mrs. Thatcher's comments made him seethe with rage. His political secretary, Judith Chaplin, wrote in her diary at the time that Mrs. Thatcher made him furious and that he called her loopy and mad. She wrote that he said he wanted the former Prime Minister isolated, destroyed.
It was at a time when almost daily there seemed to be reports of what Margaret had said. Whether she had said them or not, I don't know, but there were reports that were causing great difficulty within the party. So I was very frustrated, and I think there's no doubt at times, in the privacy with someone whom I thought I could trust, no doubt I let off steam. Quite a different matter, I think, from a considered view later.
The issue of Europe above all drove them apart, but John Major's other policies widened the gulf and led to accusations of betrayal. He scrapped Mrs. Thatcher's poll tax. He gave more money than she had planned to the health service and boosted government spending.
It was to be Thatcherism with a human face, and his actions demonstrated that. But Mrs. Thatcher was out there rampaging about, deciding that she didn't approve of what was being done. Now she was no longer there and wasn't able to be a backseat driver.
While the Prime Minister was touchy about Mrs. Thatcher, he was also thin-skinned about the press and media. Although this was one of the hazards of the job, the lampooning could be hurtful.
As your new and excitingly different Prime Minister, I'd just like to say, I am my own man. I am my own man. I am my own man.
He keeps jamming.
I am my own man.
The press cartoons could be cruel too.
The particular image that stuck was one by Steve Bell, a very radical cartoonist of The Guardian, by showing John Major with his underpants over his trousers. And they were M&S Airtex rather naff underpants. And these underpants became not just the image, but they were used as a shopping basket, as a parachute, as a doormat. They became a feature. And I think that John Major did not like that.
There's the same sort of thing with Prime Leader. I mean,
The number 10 press office tried to shield the Prime Minister from the newspapers, but to no avail. It wasn't just cartoons. He was infuriated by articles in the daily papers, often it seems on quite trivial matters.
Mrs. Major came up to me and she said, can you persuade your successor to produce the press digest that you produced. I said, I don't have to, he does. But your husband doesn't read it. Your husband reads the papers. And of course he was, I think, far too concerned about what was appearing in the media. He was a sensitive man.
Perhaps up to a point I was too sensitive about some of the things in the press. I'm happy to concede that. But the politicians who are said to have hides like rhinos and be utterly impervious to criticism, well, if they're not extinct, they're very rare. And I freely confess I wasn't amongst them.
After victory in the Gulf War, some of John Major's colleagues urged him to go to the country, taking advantage of his popularity. The Prime Minister rejected this and held on for another year. In that time he set in place his main policies, the Citizens' Charter and Europe, where he negotiated the Maastricht Treaty. In the spring of 1992, however, he could delay no longer and called the election for the 9th of April. John Major always loved campaigning, even when the prospects were not good, as they were not in 92. Polls at the start of the campaign showed the party behind Labour under Neil Kinnock.
All of us were slipstreaming in John's affair with the electorate. I think it was the extent to which the electorate trusted John and didn't trust Neil Kinnock that determined the outcome of the election. It was as simple as that.
The Prime Minister fought the election on the issue of Labour's plans to tax and spend and his own pledge to cut taxes. It was a campaign which would come to haunt him in the next Parliament. As it got underway, John Major became impatient with its many staged events and grandiose settings.
Well, I hope you like the set.
There was a lot of criticism that the campaign was staid and staged and slow and ponderous, and he wasn't getting through and all the rest of it. And that was frustrating him. And he was getting very ratty. And he said, look, tomorrow, I don't care what anyone thinks, I am going to get up on a soapbox. It's how I used to do it. It was when he was 16 on a street corner in Brixton, he would get up on a soapbox. It's a rather odd way for a teenager to spend his Saturday afternoons. That's what I want to do.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I felt at ease with it. I thought it was electioneering as it should be. And the public patently liked it. Even those who were not on our side enjoyed heckling, and I didn't mind that.
And the Liberals, quite right, and the Liberals.
And it was a real contact. It was what elections ought to be about, and I felt for the first time we had put the media to one side and had direct contact with the electorate as a whole.
But the media loved it. The television pictures of John Major on his soapbox, slugging it out with the voters of Luton, remain the abiding image of the 92 election campaign. The angry throngs, impromptu speeches and rotten eggs were in sharp contrast to Labour's more presidential-style campaign. The soapbox may not have been the deciding factor in the election, but it became forever associated with John Major's personal style. Polling took place on the 9th of April. John Major went to vote at Huntingdon, confident of victory. Many of his colleagues were less optimistic.
As the election went on, I became more pessimistic, and I remember going to my count thinking, well, there we are going to lose, and thinking it was pretty surprising that I ever expected we could win when we'd been 13 years in office, and we were in the middle of a deep recession, which we were. How on earth could a government get re-elected in those circumstances?
Major John, 48,000.
John Major remained resolutely confident of victory, despite poor polls throughout the campaign. When the results of voting came through, he was vindicated. That night he went to celebrate his triumph with the party faithful at Conservative Central Office.
We had won the election that everyone had said was unwinnable. We had polled more votes in that general election than any political party before or since has ever polled in a general election. And yet we had a tiny majority of seats. And even then I could begin to see that life in a fifth consecutive Conservative Parliament would be life in very uncharted waters indeed.
John Major's majority, only 21, was too small to give him the authority he so desperately needed. In the months and years to come, battles over Europe, conflict with Mrs. Thatcher, and above all the sterling crisis of Black Wednesday, would test him and his party to the point of destruction. It would never be glad, confident morning again.